blood cells, also known as leukocytes. Guess what leuko means? White. There are 5 types of white blood cells that are divided into 2 categories, granulocytes and agranulocytes. Granules are clusters of stuff in their cytoplasm that you can usually see on the microscope as little specks. So granulocytes have them, agranulocytes don't. The 3 types of granulocytes are neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Notice something about the names?
All in with Phil.
They all end with phil. What's phil? Remember, we have hydrophilic, love. Okay. What these phils love is a particular type of stain. A stain that's neutral in pH, a stain that's basic in pH, and a stain called eosin, which is red. Then the agranulocytes, they have smooth cytoplasm, are monocytes and lymphocytes. So they don't have phil in their names. So each one, what it looks like, which we'll see in lab today, and what it's for. Neutrophils are the most common type. There are ranges given in your book. Roughly, they make up about 60% of the white blood cells you'll find in circulation. They're a little bit larger than red blood cells. They have speckles. Even though we call them white blood cells, they're white before we stain them. After we stain them, they're purple. And those larger globs in them are actually the nucleus. A neutrophil nucleus is lobed, clustered into a couple of separate globs instead of one big glob. Their function is phagocytosis, which means cell eating, if you remember that from back in chapter 3. They are the first responders when there's an infection or tissue damage. They rush in and they start eating the damaged cells and any bacteria or invaders. They gorge themselves and die. They only live a few days. But they can get there fast and start cleaning things up before it gets out of control. So here's a little view of phagocytosis. So you get a splinter, the neutrophils rush in and they eat any bacteria that were on that splinter. And it's not shown here, but they may start eating the cells that got broken in the process. Neutrophils aren't the only ones that do phagocytosis, and we'll touch on the others that do as well. Eosinophils. These are one of the least common. They're typically 1 to 3% of the total. They also have a lobed nucleus. Usually it's 2 lobes. And because they like eosin, they'll be red. Now, the slides we have didn't get as much eosin put on them, so we're probably not going to see really bright red like that, but they should be a little bit pinker and have a different shaped nucleus from the neutrophils. Eosinophils primarily fight parasites, especially worms. So if somebody had a tapeworm, their eosinophils would be increased. They also manage allergic reactions. Basophils, these are the most rare in circulation, and it's because their function is mostly outside the blood vessels. They are going to stimulate inflammation. They do it by secreting two chemicals, histamine and heparin. Histamine causes the inflammation. Heparin prevents blood clotting so that the neutrophils can still get there. They're not blocked out. Basophils have big purple granules. They often take up the whole cell, and you can't even see the nucleus. So, questions on granulocytes? Monocytes, these are distinguished by being bigger than the rest. I'm not sure why they're called one cells, but they are. Maybe it's one visible nucleus, because it's usually not split up the way the granulocytes are. Sometimes it's round, sometimes it's bean-shaped like that. It could even end up U-shaped. So you'll see a little bit of variety. The main things are it's bigger and it doesn't have a lot of granules. Monocytes are more common than eosinophils and basophils. They come in third in prevalence. Their job is also phagocytosis, but they are slower responding than neutrophils, but then they're also more efficient once they're ready and are able to keep going instead of dying off the way the neutrophils do. When they enter the tissues, they turn into the macrophages. So monocytes are immature macrophages, basically. They can do a little phagocytosis as they are, but once they finish maturation, then they're really efficient, and they can clean up not only bacteria, but the dead neutrophils as well. And then the last one, lymphocytes, are the second most common, typically making up a quarter to a third of the red blood or white blood cells in circulation. They have a big round nucleus. Takes up almost the whole cell. They're called lymphocytes because their job is most tied in with the lymphatic system. So in this picture, it's still purple, but in some cases they look a little more blue on their cytoplasm. This is a thing to watch out for in lab is sometimes you'll see a lymphocyte and think it's a basophil because in both cases the whole thing's purple. What you want to look for is the edge of the dark purple smooth, or is it a clump inside the cell? Lymphocytes are involved in what's called active immunity, which means they fight specific invaders, like this cold virus, this flu virus, that type of bacteria. The two types are T cells and B cells. T cells directly attack and kill the invading cells. B cells produce antibodies that attack for them. So T cells are the shock troops going right in. B cells are the generals that send somebody else to do the work. And we'll talk more about what they do in chapter 16. Questions on agranulocytes? So, some tips for remembering the white blood cell names. If it's Phil, it's a granulocyte. If it's cyte, it's an agranulocyte. And in order of prevalence, you can use the mnemonic, never let monkeys eat bananas. Neutrophils most common, lymphocytes second, monocytes third, then eosinophils and basophils at the bottom. Because a lot of these guys need to get out of the circulation to do their job, they have two special properties for getting out of the blood vessels. Chemotaxis, think chemical taxi. Chemicals released in the damaged area attract, that's chemotaxis. Diapedesis is, kind of means walk through. They change their shape and squeeze to get out of the capillary and into the tissues. And this is the most likely reason for the granulocytes having the lobed nucleus, or at least one advantage of the lobed nucleus is it makes it easier to squish. The lymphocyte has to squish the nucleus also to get through. So chemotaxis tells them where to go, diapedesis gets them out. White blood cells overall make up 5 to 10,000 per microliter of blood, as compared to the 5 million of a red blood cell in that same amount. Having excess white blood cells is called leukocytosis. Usually that indicates there's an infection. You're making more to fight it off. And most of the time, once the infection's over, they'll come back down to normal. Leukopenia, penia means a decrease, so less white blood cells than normal. Some infections will cause leukopenia because there's so many of them dying in the fight, like the flu and chickenpox. And some metal poisonings can cause a decrease because they block hematopoiesis in the bone marrow. Lead, arsenic, and mercury are examples. Okay. So those relate to the overall white count. There's also a test called differential white count. We're going to do this in lab today. Here, you find 100 cells and count how many of them are which type. And you write it as percent. So a typical spread would be like 60% neutrophils, 25% lymphocytes, 9% monocytes, and so on. Leukemia is cancer of the bone marrow that results in large numbers of immature white blood cells in circulation. So this compares healthy blood, where, let's see, I see 4 white blood cells in this sample. Looks like a monocyte, 2 neutrophils, and a lymphocyte. Here in leukemia, there's a lot more of them. Most of these, you can kind of identify a cell type. There's a lot of neutrophils, couple of lymphocytes, but there's not as much granule in here. These are kind of irregular, so they're not as functional and they take up space in the blood. So, major symptoms include fatigue from the reduced red blood cells, with all those white ones taking up the space, fever and frequent infection because the white blood cells aren't functional to fight infection, and bruising because the vessels also become damaged more easily.
They don't get as much oxygen with all the white blood cells taking up space too, right?
Right, because only the red can carry the oxygen, the white can't. And that's the major thing that causes fatigue. Any other white blood cell questions? Okay, let's pause and restart.